Hello, this is going to be the third and I would imagine last instalment on this reflection on epistemology from a polytheist point of view, and pick up on some ideas that people have asked a little bit more about who've viewed the previous, well, either one of them or both of them, I'm not sure if they've watched both or just one, of the previous videos on the subject, and bring in a couple of other ideas that, despite the fact that the previous ones were quite long and rambling, I still didn't get on to. So, in terms of where to pick up from on the previous one, I wanted to get on to talking a little bit about the ideas from the French sociologist and thinker Michel Foucault, who has some interesting things to say. There's a lot of stuff he says I don't agree with at all, but he does have some interesting ideas, and there's no point throwing the baby out with the bathwater just because I disagree with some of his ideas, and kind of is not a reason to gloss over the other parts of his philosophy and thinking that are fascinating and worth engaging with. Now, Foucault was an atheist. He would have probably laughed his socks off at the idea of polytheist epistemology, but that's besides the point. Wrote prolifically and had many ideas on lots of subjects, but the particular one that I want to run with at the moment, at any rate, is an idea he advanced on what he termed the regimes of truth. Now, his argument here is quite influenced by postmodernism. He wasn't wholly a postmodernist and wasn't comfortable with that description of him or of his philosophy, but it's an idea that sort of overlaps into, if you think of like a Venn diagram of overlapping circles, it kind of spills into postmodernism. Postmodernism rejects the idea that there are objective truths and speaks instead in terms of stories, people having different stories, and runs with this idea that ultimately roots back to Karl Marx and conflict theory and sort of competing groups in society, each trying to get their own way and struggling and conflicting with each other. Whilst Marx was interested in, not to say completely fixated upon, the struggle between the rich and the poor, and saw things in very economic terms, other philosophies have picked up on this general idea of conflict and reframed it. So it's no longer always just in terms of the rich versus the poor. Sometimes it's framed in terms of gender, or in terms of race, or in terms of 101 other different things, of conflicts between rival groups. And the regime of truth idea is part and parcel of that. So it's the idea that not just individuals, because being a sociologist, Foucault didn't tend to think of people as individuals per se, but rather as members of bigger communities, bigger groups. And so our ideas and our identity and our sense of self are very much influenced by the kinds of groups we are members of, which as an idea does actually fit quite well within a polytheist ethos, because we're rooting back to ancient tribal cultures where people thought tribally, they thought collectively, they thought in terms of their tribe, their group, their family sense of belonging that they grew up in. That was a primary source of identity, and people didn't really have the kind of individualism as we understand it nowadays, at any rate. They thought in a more collective sense. So that notion of competing groups, whereas we're talking in modern days, say with Marx, talking about economic conflicts between the rich and the poor, and radical feminists talking about conflicts between men and women, and different ideas like this. There is an element where you can understand this at a tribal level as well as at these more abstract political concepts. And you could well argue that perhaps as in the West, as tribes have died off, and the ancient tribes that our ancestors would have lived in 2,000, 3,000 years ago, or less than that actually, if we're thinking in terms of maybe even really only have to go back 1,500 years to have the existence of tribes throughout the West. As those groups were killed off, warfare, famine, plague, mass migration and movements into marriage, conquering empires, sweeping in, breaking up tribal groups and reforming them into different ways and different ways and different ways. Tribalism as such has died off in the West. I no longer think of myself as a member of a particular extended family tribe. I don't think very many people do in the West think in that way anymore. But the urge, what you might call that primal cultural urge to be in a tribe is still there. We just no longer have those sorts of familial blood-based lineage tribes to belong to in quite the same way anymore. So do we, this is a question and not an answer, do we now look for other forms of identity, other forms of tribalism? And so maybe we band together in football teams and the football team becomes the new tribe. Maybe we bond together over politics, and suddenly being a Tory or a Labour or a Republican or a Democrat or this or that or the other, that becomes the new tribe. There are people who still do have very strong senses of ethnicity within their tribe. That could be people bonding together because they all come from, let's say they've migrated from one country to another, and so they're living in an area which is a bit of a ghetto with lots of other people of the same ethnicity. Even if they didn't know them back in the homeland, that they're now common language, common taste in food and cuisine and this and the other. So it creates a collective sort of an identity there, and then you get the quite dangerous, malevolent edge of racial supremacist groups, whether they're white supremacists, black supremacists, any other type of shade of supremacist, who say, oh, well, we're going to bond together and protect our ethnic identity from these other ethnic identities, and it's very much the conflict-based element going on there. So there's lots of different ways of creating identities, even boiling all the way down to TV fandom identities as a replacement tribe that it gives a sense of belonging, a sense of identity. And maybe these passionately held forms of identity are all answering that ancient tribal need that was once answered by actual blood relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, and myriad relatives that people had lived amongst in their tribe since the year dot. As that's faded, other forms of pseudo-tribalism have come in to replace those urges. And the sorts of passionate defence of the way of life of the tribe from a couple of millennia ago is now replaced by the passionate defence of whether it's loyalty to the football team, loyalty to the political party, loyalty to the TV show, loyalty to whatever it is that people are loyal to these days. It's as passionate, as fierce, as primal perhaps as the ancient form of tribal loyalty that enabled humanity to survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a very harsh environment. It's still there, hardwired into us, if you like. Coming back to Foucault, because you probably think I've lost the plot entirely and wandered away from that, partly what he's arguing is that there are groups, I'm trying to avoid the word tribe here, but they are basically kinds of like tribes, groups that form in societies, interest groups. And these interest groups, they have their members, and by implication, of course, there's the in-out bit, the people who are in the group versus everyone else who's outside the group. So you get a bit of that in-group, out-group tension going on. That's inevitable. They have often their kind of ritual joining ceremonies, that sort of thing, ways of becoming and identifying yourself as a member of that community, as a member of that group. And they have their ambitions, their things that they wish to achieve, which could be sometimes quite small-scale stuff, all the way up to quite grandiose ambitions. So at the small-scale level, you might say that your family, your ambitions is to pay the mortgage and put food on the table each week, or each month in the case of the mortgage. And that's it. It's just simple surviving, getting through society are the ambitions of most families at the end of the day, especially those for whom the ability to financially survive is not assured, then that kind of becomes even more heightened. All the way up to the opposite end, the grandiose ambitions, political parties who want to change society, if not indeed change the entire world, and have these very big scale ambitions that they want to achieve. And all of the kind of shades in between, of levels in between, of plans and hopes and dreams and ambitions and things we want. And the emphasis here is we, not I, the individual, but we, the collective. We want to achieve this, we want to achieve that, we want to make this, that and the other happen. To do that, you need shared values, shared concepts, shared ideas, and this is where we're getting, finally, back to the plot of the regime of truth. The regime of truth is the agreed truth within that community. This is what is right. So put it in nice easy terms, let's say you've got a political party, and it doesn't matter left wing, right wing, centrist, all of that. It's the same for all of them in a sense. They'll have their regimes of truth, might be their economic policies. What is the right way to run an economy? Oh, well, it's this way. It could be to do with government funding. What should governments fund? What should they not fund? And there's a sense of, well, our vision of what they ought to fund is the correct one, is the true one, and that other party over there, that rival party, they have daft, silly, misguided ideas. Their claim about what is the best way to run the world is false. Our claim about the best way to run, well, the country, maybe, not the world, the country, our claim is correct. And when we get into power, we'll implement our policies and we'll prove to everyone else that our policies were correct, because they'll bring about a flourishing economy and a fantastic health service, this, that and the other. They'll achieve the things we want to achieve. And likewise, let's say religious groups. A religion will have its regimes of truth, that the divine is like this and the afterlife is like that, and these are the festivals we should be celebrating, and this is how we should be celebrating them. These are the right ways to live your life, the moral ways to live your life. Those are the immoral, naughty ways to live your life. These are our truths, and these truths have come to us from God, or whatever the source of the information may be. So there'll be different notions as to what is true, what is correct. And part of that is an epistemology. So it's not only what is true, but also a statement of how we in the group know it to be true. And if we're faced with other questions about unexpected things in the future, this is the way we go about, this is the method, the route we use to find the answers to questions that no one has asked us yet. This is our epistemology for establishing the truth of things. So again, a fairly obvious example, let's say you've got a group of Christians, some denomination or another of Christians, their regime of truth. How do Christians know the truth? Well, the Bible is how Christians know the truth of the life of Jesus and the apostles and various other moral teachings and moral codes, moral revelations. Where did the Bible come from? Well, it was given to humanity by God. So ultimately, the Bible is kind of, like, if you like, the first step of truth, and beyond that is God who gave the Bible to humanity. So the Bible is the word of God. So God and the Bible become one and the same thing in a sense, as a conveyance of truth. And let's say some amazing new scientific procedure is developed, and somebody goes along to a vicar or a priest or a bishop or whoever it may be and says, well, what do we as good Christians do about stem cell research? What's the truth, what's the moral thing, the ethical thing to do about stem cell research? Well, there's a number of different answers that could be given in terms of epistemology. How do you as a Christian know what to do? What the right thing to do is, the true thing to do is, well, you could pray. You could pray and ask for guidance directly from God, which might come to you as a voice in the dark, or a dream, or a sort of an intuitive revelation. Or, just as likely, if not indeed more likely, sit and read your Bible, and nowhere in the Bible will you find the phrase stem cell research, obviously, but you might find something that can be interpreted as giving guidance about stem cell research. And so metaphor, imagery, and obviously or nature of metaphor is that three people will read the same verse and interpret that metaphor in three totally different ways. So it's still not a clear-cut matter of saying read the Bible and the answer will be absolutely there. It's more a case of read the Bible, you'll find a passage, and then you have to interpret it about this new issue, which wasn't understood at the point in time when the Bible was written. And likewise, Muslims could say the same about the Quran, and Jews about the Torah, and so on, that you have methodologies for establishing the truth, a route to an epistemology. This is how you go about finding out the truth of a thing. Prayer, reading the sacred scripture, meditation, all sorts of things that you could do to establish the truth of what to do in a given situation, if that given situation is not directly addressed, clearly, overtly, blatantly addressed in the text in the first place. We'll get onto the polytheist element again in a second, but coming back to Foucault, his argument is you've got all these different groups in societies, different religions, different political parties, different interest groups, all sorts of different groups, and they each have their own regime of truth, their own ideas of what is right, but also their own epistemologies of how they go about establishing what is right. So the epistemology for the Labour Party is going to be different from the epistemology for the Conservative Party, about how they negotiate and establish which policies they should have about something. How do they engage in it? Whose voices do they listen to? What's the process of establishing the truth and the correctness of a political policy? Different religions will have different approaches to establishing the truth of a religious idea or a moral injunction of how to live your life, things like that. There are also scientific regimes of truth. So the scientific communities have their regimes of truth. So how do you go about establishing the truth of a scientific theory? Well, you test and you retest and you retest, and you use scientific methodologies to go about establishing that. What about psychologists and sociologists? Well, that's within the science field, but it's social science rather than hard science, and so they have slightly different techniques that they go about. Some of it can be similar in the sense of psychologists often like to do tests and retests and retests. Sociologists less so, but you have procedures and methods you go about assessing and evaluating and establishing claims of truth, and then saying, well, this claim to truth has more evidence behind it than that claim to truth has, and there's negotiations. And also a thing that Foucault picks up on, there are hierarchies within groups, notions that some people have a better grasp on what is the truth than other people do, and sometimes that's down to something as simple as time. This person only joined the group last week, therefore they don't know an awful lot yet. That person joined the group 50 years ago, and so they've got a lot more experience to draw upon, a lot more background and learning to draw upon. So if you want to know the, let's say within medicine, the truth of a medical procedure, what is the correct medical procedure to use, would you want to consult someone who is in their first year at medical school, a student who's only been on the course for 6 months? Or would you want to consult a surgeon who's been working in the field for 40 years? Now, it's possible, of course, and sometimes it does happen, that relative newcomers have fantastic insights into something that people who are long established in a certain way of doing things have become a bit crusty and a bit kind of fixed in their ways, who don't necessarily see what the brand new person has some insight to. But that is relatively rare. Usually you are more likely to trust the very experienced person than the inexperienced person. But that's not always the case with hierarchies, that these things are automatically based on duration of experience. Sometimes it's based upon other things. So you might be expected to have, in some groups, quite a rigid hierarchy. The church is a good example of that, where you've got vicars and bishops and archbishops and all the way up. So there is an established hierarchy of pecking order, if you like, and so there might be an assumption that you need to talk to somebody at this level, not at that level of the hierarchy, if you've got a query about certain things. So you would negotiate that hierarchy in a certain way. And Foucault having this bit of a kind of somewhat Marxist underpinning to his thinking, is quite interested in how these hierarchies operate, and as far as he's concerned, because again he's got this postmodernist thing that there is no objective truth, he sees it more as power struggles. So who is absolutely right, this bishop or that bishop, is less important than how Bishop A and Bishop B go around their power struggles because they disagree with each other. How do they kind of use power and hierarchies and language and this and that and the other to fight it out to see which bishop's theology wins? Or it could be two scientists, or it could be two politicians, or it could be two anybody going through a sort of I think this, oh no I think that, and then clashing with each other. Foucault's much more interested in the way the power struggle happens than he is in the sense that one of them is true and correct and the other one is mistaken. He's not thinking in those terms. Which I think is a bit where the theory falls down, to be honest, because that postmodern dismissal of objective truth is, in my opinion at least, an unwise one, but it does open up an interesting can of worms in that even where there are objective truths, you can still have power games and power struggles and people using all sorts of somewhat dodgy techniques to fight it out with each other, handbags at dawn, to try and prove their side of the argument in ways that don't simply rely on somebody saying, look, this is true because. It's not always that straightforward, even within the scientific community, which does place tremendous emphasis on objective truth, or at least it has done until very, very recently. Even there, a bit of postmodernism is starting to creep in, but okay. So, in other words, there's different ways of understanding what is true about something. Now, Foucault, in his various books, he's got books talking about sexuality and books talking about mental illness and all sorts of other things. But to take a small example of how this could be understood, we'll go for the mental illness example. Now, let's say you have Joe Bloggs, and Joe Bloggs is convinced that there is a goblin in the corner of the room and the goblin is talking to him. Nobody else can see the goblin. Only Joe Bloggs can see the goblin. Only Joe Bloggs can hear the goblin. Nobody else can. And when the goblin is running around the room, no one else, they don't hear footsteps, they don't see things getting knocked over or anything like that. It's just an experience confined to Joe Bloggs' head, if we can put it like that. Now, what do we understand is going on here? Different regimes, different people from within different regimes would understand this differently. And Foucault spells out this sort of shifting history of how these things have been understood, at least up until his lifetime when he was writing. He died in, 85, 86, so obviously more recent changes are not included in his books. Give examples of this. If we go back to, let's say, 1,000 years ago, Joe Bloggs is living in the 11th century and having experiences of goblins. How would people of the day have understood him? Well, who would they have turned to as being the appropriate person to say what is going on with Joe Bloggs? Probably the church. They would have turned to the church and the local priest, the local vicar, and I've asked him, Joe Bloggs says he sees a goblin, we can't see a goblin. What's going on? And the priest would have come in and sought an explanation. And that explanation would have been informed by the Bible, would have been informed by understandings that, according to the Bible, there are invisible presences in the world, angels and demons and so forth. Is this thing that Joe Bloggs can see, is it an angel, is it a demon, is it this, is it that? There would be a procedure to go through, and there would be potential answers to the problems that might, for example, include exorcism, and the consideration that just because no one else can see or hear the goblin does not automatically mean the goblin does not exist. So it would have been treated in a particular way and responded to in a particular way, which isn't to say everyone would automatically have believed Joe Bloggs. There's even in the 11th century they still had the idea that some people were simply delusional not every strange presence was automatically an angel or a demon or what have you. Sometimes they were just figments of a disturbed mind, but at least it would have been considered as a serious possibility. Maybe Joe Bloggs really can see something. Is it a good something, a bad something? Is it this, is it that? These are the kinds of issues, the understandings that would have been addressed, and that have had their own methodology for going about establishing the truth of that. And even though I'm saying this is the 11th century, there's many, many parts of the world today where the first port of call would be to go to the religious institutions in the community, and whether they're priests or imams or shamans or whatever they might be in that particular part of the world, in that particular culture, to go to the religious authorities and say, we don't understand what's going on with Joe Bloggs. Can you come in and advise and assess the situation and evaluate it and tell us what's happening? And there would be the religious traditions and precepts within that community to try and help establish what is true about the situation. And so that would be the regime that would be followed, not just in the 11th century, but still today in many parts of the world. Things begin to shift, they begin to turn, they begin to change. We move into a more medical era as the scientific community develops and separates itself from the religious community, bearing in mind that at one point a lot of priests and monks were engaged in academic studies, what we would now class as scientific research, but gradually in Western Europe the church and the scientific community drifted apart, and science established its own regime of truth with its own methodologies and its own convictions about the nature of the world. And so if this were, let's say, 1920 rather than the 11th century, and somebody said, oh, Joe Bloggs is seeing things and we can't see them, who would they have turned to? Would it have been the local vicar? Well, they might, but they're perhaps more likely to go to the local doctor. And it's a medical regime rather than a scientific regime in the broader sense. So although medicine obviously is part of science, there are plenty of other parts of science too. Would they have gone to a physicist, a chemist, a geologist? No, they wouldn't. They would have gone to a doctor, a practitioner of that type of science, medical science specifically. So the family or next door neighbours, whoever, might have taken Joe Bloggs down to the local doctor and said, we have no idea what's going on with Joe Bloggs, can you explain? And again, there would be a scientific regime of truth to evaluate Joe Bloggs. Was he suffering from a tumour pressing on his brain that might be causing him to hallucinate? Had he been drinking like a fish and seeing pink elephants as well as goblins? Had he been doing this? Had he been doing that? They would be looking perhaps to chemical causes, medication, alcohol, biological causes like brain tumours, all sorts of possible causes they could look to as to why Joe Bloggs thinks he can see goblins running around the room. And again, in terms of just as the prescribed possible treatments within the 11th century church might have included exorcism, so the prescribed possible treatments within the 1920s medical realm might have been medication, might have been ECT, might have been a variety of possible medical treatments as opposed to religious treatments, because the regimes have their ways of describing what is true about the world, their ways of evaluating and assessing whether or not this, that or the other is happening in a given situation, and their own recommended responses, what you ought to do if. So whereas one regime of truth might say, well, we ought to have an exorcism, a different regime of truth might say, well, try these pills, or try this surgery, or try this medical intervention of one sort or another. And so that begins to develop. But of course within medicine itself there are shifting regimes of truth, particularly if we're thinking of psychiatry and psychology, counselling, various forms of therapy, different ideas and notions as to how the mind is best understood. So had Joe Bloggs been taken along to a Freudian, they might have got a very different answer than if they'd gone along a few decades later to a Jungian or to a behavioural therapist or whichever type of therapist they're looking at. So even within a broad regime of truth, there can be kind of subsections, if you like, of competing different ideas as to what is true, how to assess truth, and what to do in response to challenging issues, but also even defining what is a challenging issue in the first place. Is this a problem, or is this not a problem? So again, take it. Well, I already mentioned that Foucault talks about sexuality. So somebody takes their teenage son along to the local advisory wise person, be that a priest or a doctor or whoever, and says, "My son fancies other men. Is this a problem?" And in some communities they would say, absolutely yes, your son is possessed of demons making him feel in this way. And other communities and other periods of history might say, yes, your son is suffering from a chemical imbalance in his brain or a genetic flaw that is causing him to think and desire other men. And in some periods of history, the wise sage of the community would say, well, so what? That's not a problem, is it? Surely. Why are you making a fuss about that? Who cares? Doesn't matter if he fancies other men, so what? So the regime of truth is partly defining what constitutes a problem in the first place. This thing is a problem according to one regime of truth, but according to a different regime of truth, actually it's not a problem at all. It's perfectly okay. So it's different ways of evaluating the world and what should be done about it in response. Is there a polytheist, coming back to that block, polytheist regime of truth? Well, there is not a polytheist regime of truth. There are different ones, different competing ones. So if Joe Bloggs, who would obviously not be called Joe Bloggs if we went back to ancient Greece, but if he were taken along to the local temple in ancient Greece, let's say he's taken along to the temple of Asclepion, the god of medicine, and the family of Joe Bloggs says, well, goblins, well, it wouldn't be goblins, would it, if it was ancient Greece? There's some dryads, he's seeing dryads. What do we do about this? Because none of us can see these dryads. The way of understanding it and interpreting it would have been different again. So they might have thought in terms that yes, there are dryads and invisible spirits in the world. Maybe he can see something. Is the something he is seeing a friendly force or a dangerous force? Is he blessed as opposed to mad and disturbed? Is he possessed of wondrous spiritual powers and psychic gifts that he can see into the spirit world and maybe bring useful advice from the spirit world to the community? So again, this kind of reflection on defining what is a problem in the first place. The fact that Joe Bloggs sees something nobody else sees in one community might be regarded as a sign of demonic evil forces. In a different community, different regime of truth, it might be regarded as a sign of chemical imbalance and disturbance in the brain that needs to be cured and treated, and is viewed with sympathy. Poor Joe Bloggs, how sad, how poor man, let's give him some medication. In a different community, it might be regarded as a great blessing. Isn't it wonderful that Joe Bloggs has this power to commune with the invisible presences in the world? So different communities are going to be responding in different ways. If you're not a postmodernist, and you do believe in objective truth, which one of them, if any of them, is objectively correct? Is Joe Bloggs blessed with an amazing power to see the spirit realm? Is he possessed by scary and evil demons that must be exorcised? Is he a sad and unfortunate ill person who needs help and therapy to readjust the functioning of his brain so he can stop seeing hallucinatory things? What is going on? A postmodernist would simply say, well, you know, each community to its own, live with the consequences. But if you're interested in the idea of objective truth, I mean, some communities might have a more upbeat, positive approach than others, but that doesn't mean they're correct, doesn't mean they're right. No one said the truth has to be upbeat all of the time and positive and jolly and lovely and huggy and cuddly all of the time. It's not all about how you feel in a nice cuddly way. Sometimes the truth is depressing and horrible and unpleasant. But obviously, given that Joe Bloggs is a completely imaginary person, you can't answer this question straightforwardly, but the example of how an ancient temple might have responded to Joe Bloggs would be within the context of their regime of truth, and that regime includes the hierarchy of who is it that you would go and talk to. Would you go and talk to the priest at the temple? Would you go and talk to the healer in the mud hut on the edge of the village? Would you go and talk to this person, that person, some other person? The hierarchy of knowing who to talk to when you have a certain type of problem is part of this regime of truth. If we're going back into time, one of the things we tend to find, to a point, is a greater degree of cultural homogeneity than we have today. In that if you have a medieval village or an ancient British village 2,000 years in the past, it tends to be the same bunch of families who've been living in that community since the year dot, who tend to share the same values, the same dress styles, the same cuisine, the same language, the same religious outlook, the same political outlook. They tend to have a lot in common with each other by the nature of things. That's not true of everywhere in the ancient world, because clearly you've got places like Rome, which were huge multicultural melting pots with people from all over the empire living there. But many communities were small and basically fairly static in terms of their culture, so there wasn't huge changes going on. Whereas today, obviously, we are, particularly in the West and many other parts of the world as well, cultural plurality is much more common, much more widespread. So you have lots of different religions, different politics, different competing values and ideas and so forth. You don't have consistency of someone in a town or a city, or indeed even a village quite frequently, who's experiencing something odd, and automatically everyone around them will say, oh, you need to go and talk to so-and-so, because so-and-so is the expert, the wise person on dealing with that type of problem. In other words, we don't all share the same regime of truth. So I can have one regime of truth, my next door neighbour has another regime of truth, because my next door neighbour is from a different part of the world and follows a different religion than the one I do, and likewise the neighbours on that side are different again, and the people who live on the opposite side of the road to me are all very different again. So we don't, even within this one street, we don't have shared regimes of truth in the way that if I'd been living in a village 2,000 years ago, I would have shared pretty much the same regime of truth as everybody else in the village. So we've now moved into this much more kind of multicultural milieu with lots of very different points of view as to what is true, and how to establish truth, and how to negotiate situations when you are faced with a real problem, or at least you're confused and you don't know what to do about something. Who is it that you talk to? Whose regime of truth do you consult? The doctor, the priest, the imam, the rabbi, the agony aunt, the herbalist, the aromatherapist. You could go on listing 1,001 different types of people who could dispense you wisdom on how to deal with any given situation. Sometimes, say, some of them slightly wiser than others, perhaps, but who is it that you turn to? How do we establish what's true, what's not true in any given situation? It's not clear-cut anymore, and if the world continues in the vein it is, and presumably it will do for a good period of time yet, it's not likely to become suddenly any more clear-cut in 20 years' time than it is today. And so modern day forms of polytheism and other types of paganism, non-polytheist types of paganism, add to this great cultural mix and provide different answers, and sometimes not always consistent with each other, in the sense that you could talk to 3 different Wiccans or 3 different heathens or 3 different druids and come away with at least 16 different answers. So even within, there is not necessarily that consistency of what Foucault refers to as these regimes of truth, or methods of establishing communal regimes of truth in the same way. And that poses some interesting challenges, in that community cohesion requires an exploration of notions of truth, an exploration of methodologies. How do you establish truth of new situations that happen? It requires people to come together and not necessarily agree with every single thing each other says, but to discuss, explore, expand, come to some shared agreements, some shared commonalities, and methods and approaches. And even if you don't much like the word hierarchy, some people are very antithetical to that word, some notion of who is the appropriate person, and equally who is the inappropriate person to talk to, consult for advice on a given situation, which doesn't feel as if it's happening too much at the moment within the polytheist realm, let alone in any other realm. But maybe it is a habit. I'm just kind of out of the picture, a bit out of the loop, and maybe these things are happening. I hope they are, and we will move towards some more cohesive approach, some better understanding of this, for lack of a better phrase, regime of truth. And does there need to be? Will there ultimately be one that unites all polytheists, or will there be like a Hellenic one and a Roman one and a heathen one and a Druidic one and so on and so forth? I have no idea. Having mentioned the sort of church regime of truth earlier, that the priest, the vicar, the bishop, etc., they can pray to God, they can read the Bible, they can establish canon law. There's all sorts of ways within the various different churches of seeking truth and establishing truth of a religious nature. Are those approaches valid in a slightly different way, obviously, within the polytheist realm? You can certainly talk to the gods, there's plenty of them to talk to. 20 different people could all pray to Aphrodite and consult her. Will they get the same? Will they get consistent answers? Well, you'd kind of hope so, but if they all got very contradictory answers, that would really confuse the picture a lot. We don't have the sacred text in the same way. We don't have that Bible or Quran or Rig Veda to consult. There are, as mentioned in earlier podcasts, things like the Havamal and the Theogony. There are texts, but they don't serve quite the same function as the Bible does in Christianity or as the Quran does in Islam. They function in a slightly different way, and they're not necessarily regarded in that same devout way as being the revealed word of deity. At least not these days. Maybe in the distant past they were, but not so much these days. So if we want to know what is the word of Odin on a given thing, you could read the Havamal. But even within heathenry, do people treat the Havamal in the same way that Muslims treat the Quran or Christians treat the Bible, as the revealed word of Odin? Or would it be better to meditate, to commune, to go out into the woods, to talk to the presence, the spirit of Odin in whatever place you feel is best suited to sense him? And then what do you do if what he says to you is markedly different from what he says to that other person who lives down the road? Which becomes an interesting one with certain deities. I think, sticking within the heathen realm, you've got Loki, who is famed for being a rather tricky character, who has a somewhat chaotic sense of humour, who would not automatically be seen as someone whose word is true in the usual sense that the word truth is meant, in that he might say something whose truth needs a hell of a lot of contemplation to find, because it may not be face value truth, it might be a much more sort of subtle, nuanced truth. Many pantheons have a figure rather like that, who is quite a challenging, difficult, tricky sort of a figure, where you would not necessarily automatically take their word at face value. You might have to think about it a lot more to work out what it is that they're telling you. So your means of establishing a regime of truth as a polytheist becomes interesting, in that just as at a more human level, you've got a medical problem, you probably want to go to a doctor. If you have got a leaky pipe, you'd want to consult a plumber. Different specialists for different issues. Within polytheism, you've got this whole pantheon of deities, 101 different deities. Who is it that you would consult for guidance on particular subjects, particular types of truth? Now, I suppose a fairly obvious answer might be, well, if you want relationship advice, you go to the deity particularly associated with love and romance. If you want medical advice, you go to the deity primarily associated with healing. At one degree that works, but let's say you want some profound philosophical insight into the nature of life, the universe and everything. It's not unreasonable to expect any deity to have profound insight into life, the universe and everything. I mean, what's the point of being a deity if you don't? But would you get the same answers from all of them? Or would they phrase their answers differently, give their guidance differently? Would they not necessarily lie, but we're coming back to this element from one of the earlier talks within Jainism about the blind men and the elephant, where maybe the nature of life, the universe and everything is so gargantuan that all your human mind, your mortal mind could cope with would be a sort of a small snapshot of it. So this deity might give you that small snapshot, and that deity might give you that small snapshot. And like each one is handing you a jigsaw piece, none of them are handing you the entire completed jigsaw, because it would be too big for your brain to cope with and comprehend. In one of my books I used, I think it was an ant, I think was the analogy, of an ant looking at a human being and thinking, what the hell is that? Would the ant even be able to see an entire human being? Because we are humongous compared to an ant. Would they maybe kind of get a sense of your toe or your finger or your nose, and anything more than that is just, whoa, too much to comprehend? Are we like ants looking at the universe? And it's all so vast and gargantuan that we would struggle to comprehend the answers we want from the questions we ask. So we'd be given a little bit, because that's all we can really cope with. And so when we appear to get contradictory answers, different people get contradictory answers from the same deity, or the same person gets different answers from 6 different deities, is it rather that what you're getting from each of them is jigsaw pieces? Because your brain can't cope with the full thing. Yet, maybe in some future life when you've reincarnated into something weird, but at the moment your brain can only take you so far. And it's just human egomania that we assume we can cope with much more than we can cope with. Possible notions to mull over. Another element I wanted to sort of slide into, is not completely unrelated to this, is the idea that regimes of truth, and this is something that Wittgenstein was quite keen on, fascinated by the idea of language games and so forth. Each regime tends to have its own language. Doctors speak in medical jargon, imams talk in the theological language of the Quran, Catholic priests talk in the theological language of the Bible. Each specialist body has its own language. And if you're not in that specialist body, half the words might just go straight over your head and you think, well, I don't know what the hell they're on about. I don't even know what that word means. But they use their language. And it's not just a case of using specialist jargon terms, complicated terms that people outside that community don't understand. But even when they're using day-to-day terms, they're not necessarily using them in the same way. And it's this sort of nuance of trying to get into another language. It's very much like the arguments made around learning a foreign language. If you're an English person and you're trying to learn Japanese, you can, there are plenty enough people who do, but will you ever really understand the language in the same way that a Japanese person would who's been learning it from the cradle? Is their grasp of their language subtly different from the way in which a foreigner who's only learned that language as a second language can attain to? Do you ever get the nuance, the humour, the ambiguities, the allusions and the hints and the metaphors and all of that? Because as language, as so often has been pointed out, is as much about what we don't say as it is about what we do say. And that shifts from one culture's language to another. So allusions that you could make in English you might not be able to make in Spanish, and vice versa, because of the way the languages are structured. And so there is this kind of learning of a language when you come to a regime. And so somebody they convert to polytheism. They haven't been born into a polytheist family, they come to it at whatever age they are when they come to it. Part of that conversion process is learning the language, learning the jargon, learning the terms, learning the outlook, the ways of thinking, the ways of not just using the fancy specialist language, but even ways of using day-to-day ordinary language. Isn't necessarily in quite the same way. And just as an English-born person learning Japanese as a second language, if you were born to a Christian family or an atheist family or a Jewish family or whatever, and then you convert to another religion later in life, in this case polytheist religion, but it could apply to any religion, will you ever fully understand it in the same way as a person raised from the cradle in that faith? So we as 21st century converts to an ancient religion, can I understand the Celtic deities, as an example? Can I understand Cernunnos, the god of the forest, in the same way as somebody living in ancient Gaul 2,000 years ago, who was born and raised in that culture, that faith, that mysticism, that way of life from birth, the way they would understand Cernunnos? And I think the answer is almost certainly not. But that doesn't mean it's not worth communing, because even though my understanding will be different and more limited, it's still of great value and an enhancement to life. Moving into a slightly bleaker take on language, perhaps, branching off into a mixture of George Orwell and Leon Festinger. Orwell, the author, and Festinger was a psychologist. Festinger argued, I don't know if he got the idea from Orwell, he might well have done, he might well have read 1984 and got the idea from there, but Festinger argued that we have these two experiences, all of us, doesn't matter what kind of person we're talking about, we all have these experiences of cognitive consonance and cognitive dissonance. Consonance is when our ideas gel with each other. Let's say we've got 2 or 3 ideas in our head and they gel with each other, they make sense, they combine well, and you get a sense of consonance. It's also when your thoughts and your behaviours marry up. You think A and you do A. There is a harmony, a continuity. There is consonance, it feels good. Dissonance, and being a therapist, he was much more interested in dissonance because that's his bread and butter. Dissonance is when your ideas don't match, when you think this thing here and you think that thing there and they contradict each other and they kind of clash. Or you think one thing and you do the dead opposite. And so your behaviour is clashing with your thought patterns. And again, they're not making sense, they're not harmonious. And at some level, you will be aware of that fact, especially if some awkward bugger puts you on the spot and asks difficult questions. And then you suddenly are forced to confront the fact that you don't make any sense. And as far as Festinger was concerned, most of us don't really make any sense. We're all full of contradictory ideas and attitudes and behaviours and whatnot. and we spend a lot of our life struggling to deal with dissonance. One way of the healthy way of dealing with dissonance is to realise that when A clashes with B, something has got to change. You can't go on clashing forever and ever. Something has got to give, something has got to change. It's not obvious what. Does A change, or does B change, or do you bring in C and that somehow balances out A and B? But we have lots of these problems. Now, where this flips back to George Orwell and his 1984 novel, is that the sinister government that had taken over the world in this futuristic fantasy. Fantasy, yeah. Some people seem to treat it as a blueprint, don't they? Had the idea of double think, that the government, this fantasy government, nightmare government, went out of its way to make its citizens engage in dissonant thinking, in what in the book is referred to as doublethink, getting them to believe two opposite things or contradictory things, getting them to believe something that is patently not true. And interestingly, not just believe, just parrot it as a sort of lip service thing, but actually internalise it and believe it. Why did they do this? Well, in the novel, it's to make people malleable. The more you can bully people into doublethink about one issue, it's like it's kind of flicking the first domino. You get them to double think about one thing, and then it's much easier to get them to double think about the next and the next and the next and the next. So it's a form of psychological manipulation, not to say outright torture. He also refers to this as black-white. So getting people to believe contradictory, false things at the same time, to be in this black-white state, which is cognitive dissonance. But it's, whereas Festinger is saying this kind of just happens, human nature being what it is, we drop ourselves into cognitive dissonance because we pick up ideas here, there and everywhere, and we don't sit under olive trees having deep philosophical thoughts like ancient Greek philosophers and mulling over our ideas to make sure they make sense. We just kind of, a bit like a kleptomaniac, we're just picking up bits here, there and everywhere, barely aware of what we're picking up as we roll along, and very rarely thinking about it until that awkward bugger asks us some question that makes us stop and go, oh, actually, that doesn't make any sense. That's difficult. And then we've got to resolve the problem with our own mind because it doesn't make sense. Foucault, being the old cynic that he was, argued that regimes tend to engage in a lot of this sort of doublethink and black-white think, of getting people to believe things that don't necessarily make a great deal of sense or are frequently contradictory, but there is a sort of an ideology at play where in order to be a member of this group you have to think certain things, even if it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. And the more sinister and manipulative the group is, the more sort of pervasive that doublethink becomes, the getting people not only to think it but to say it, to parrot it. And that's a big part of Orwell's book, is people living in fear of the regime cracking down on them if they say the wrong thing or they think the wrong thing, and constantly maintaining this frightened pretense of having to pretend to think things that don't make any sense. Is there any of that within polytheism and paganism? Well, I'm not naive enough to say no, because every system of thought has its kind of fracture points where things don't necessarily make a great deal of sense if you think about them too much. But what is the language of polytheism is an interesting area to go into. What are the truths and what are the flawed forms of thinking and so forth within polytheism? That's a whole area in and of itself to discuss and explore, and to try to reduce as much as anybody can possible areas of doublethink within the polytheist traditions, possible areas of spouting nonsense. I think maybe with the advent of social media and people talking unmitigated twaddle, even more than I'm talking right now, unmitigated twaddle on social media, and praising each other up for talking out the back of their heads, it's become quite pervasive in a lot of modern paganism, not just the polytheist type, but across the board. A lot of really quite bizarre, unhealthy, destructive ways of thinking have become quite pervasive, and that's something we need to consider. You could well argue, which I'm hoping to bring this yet again back to the point, part of the difficulty is if you don't have a consistent, reliable sense of epistemology to assess claims of truth, whether those claims of truth are in the medical arena or the psychological arena or the sociological arena or the political arena or any other bloody arena. How do you assess claims of truth? You need a methodology to do that. And a kind of Orwell's book is about this awful, wicked government that destroys people's capacity to assess truth and browbeats them into just parroting whatever it tells them, even if what it tells them on Tuesday is totally different to what it told them on Monday. You must parrot whatever you're told at the time and not point out that this is inconsistent with what they said yesterday. It's the kind of trick that politicians like to use when they say one thing in March and the dead opposite in May, and somehow assume that you won't notice, and if you do notice, they'll deny it. Oh, I never said that. So having strong methods of evaluating truth, of assessing epistemological claims is quite important, and scientific claims are assessed by the scientific method. Claims within religion, any given religion, you can suggest maybe need to be assessed by the methodologies within that religion, by the epistemologies within that religion. What are their methods of assessing their own truth? So given the Christian example, you can pray to God, you can pray to Christ. If you're Catholic, you can pray to the Virgin Mary, you can read your Bible, you can read the 1,001 theological texts that have been written over the centuries by all sorts of wise and weighty people, and try to assess claims made by using those approaches. What are the approaches that polytheists use? And I think this is having said something, I mean, we can pray and communicate with deities, we can read some of the texts, although the status of those texts is open to question and debate. But maybe we also need to develop other forms of method, other forms of epistemological assessment, to try and come together as a community and think, well, how do we assess the claims made? So that we move beyond unsubstantiated personal gnosis, which is a concept mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts, and we maybe move to kind of triangulate arguments and ideas between each other, and go into this in more depth. So this isn't me giving you answers as to how we do it, but rather just flagging up the need for us to do it and why we need to do it, to try and have our own internal methods for assessing our own internal claims of different types of truth, different types of understanding. Now, I was going to start wittering on about the idea of story. Again, I'll keep talking about that. And how we understand stories as narrative structures to our lives. I've touched upon this in a couple of the earlier podcasts. I was going to come back to that in this podcast, but I've droned on for over an hour now, so I think I'll do that in a separate podcast, in a different context, and leave this one here for now. I think I've gone over more than enough for the time being. So if you've got any questions, do chuck them in, because that helps me to know A, that people are listening in the first place, and B, to touch upon things that you're interested in rather than necessarily only things that I'm interested in. But hopefully this has sort of prompted a few thoughts. There have been a couple of questions about the nature of faith, but I'm going to address those in a separate podcast, because I think that's a topic within itself, rather than something to drown in a overlong waffle around epistemology, so I'll leave that one there, and hopefully it's provoked some thought and some interest, and yeah, wait to hear from you.